Begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which this event takes place and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'll introduce Cameron Francis. Cameron provides training and support along with the Dovetail team to people working in the youth alcohol and drug sector in Queensland.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, here in the room today at Whyalla and everybody online. Thanks for the introduction, Rod. So today's presentation is about plant-based substances. So I'll have to acknowledge to start with that these are not really commonly available substances, that we're not going to have our services overtaken by young people becoming dependent on some of these drugs. In many cases, these are the rare butterflies of our work that we might stumble across occasionally. You're probably more likely to have a client who has at some point used some of these substances in the past, but it's unlikely many of these are reasons for their presentation. The emergency department is a little bit different because we do know some of these plants do cause presentations through the ED. But instead, today's presentation is just to give you an awareness of the range of substances that are out there and what some of them do and look like and how people use them. So firstly, I'd also acknowledge traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today and pay respects to elders past and present. That's our spiel. I won't do it. Rod did a great job. Dovetail works with services that work with young people. That's all I'll say about that. You can our contact details are at the end if you're interested in more. Now, the first drug that we're going to talk about is DMT, which is a really interesting substance which is found in nature. The DMT occurs it's most commonly known in the form of ayahuasca, and ayahuasca is a tea which is traditionally used in South America. Shamans in South America would make up a brew containing two different ingredients, and on the screen there you can see the green plant material is the Psychotria viridis plant, and that contains DMT in the leaf. The brown woody looking stuff is the Banisteriopsis carpi vine, which contains an MAOI, a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So DMT is a naturally occurring chemical. It's a tryptamine, very similar to serotonin. When it's ingested, the monoamine oxidase in our gut will break it down and destroy it, which is why you need to combine it with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor to allow the DMT to pass through the gut. So it involves that combination of two different chemicals. This is a picture of a shaman traditionally using it. In South America, mostly rainforest areas, so in particularly places like Brazil, the shaman would consume the ayahuasca with a person, often in a group setting, and the shaman would then use that psychedelic state to locate the source of an illness. And they would often use different things like chanting, or they'd use a blowpipe, and they'd say they'd locate an illness somewhere in your body, and they'd blow it around your body and blow it out your shoulder with a blowpipe and remove the source of the illness. And there's a whole range of different sort of traditional practices around how that works as a medicine. It's also become really popular for Western tourists to travel to South America and do ayahuasca tourism. And ayahuasca tourism has become quite a thing. If you just Google it, there's a number of ayahuasca retreats in South America, which anybody can pay, in some cases, thousands of dollars to travel to and to take ayahuasca in a semi-traditional setting. There's a lot of controversy around some of these kinds of retreats. Some of them are really just selling Westerners this really nice idea of what exotic mysticism is all about, and there's a whole range of ethical problems with it. There's also been deaths associated with Westerners travelling to some of these ayahuasca retreats as well. They're not all super well managed and super well run. There's also some of the ayahuasqueros, the shamans who run ayahuasca ceremonies, also travel the world and do ayahuasca tours, occasionally to Australia as well, and there'll be different famous shamans doing the touring circuit in northern New South Wales in particular. That will be on the underground kind of ayahuasca scene. But it's become popular. I think it's made it onto the front page of major magazines. A number of celebrities, I'm pretty sure Lindsay Lohan has done ayahuasca and talked about it all over Twitter. So it's actually become relatively mainstream, and there's a number of Rolling Stone magazine articles about it, etc. So it's developed a bit of a popular awareness about it. In Australia, it's a little different because we have DMT naturally occurring here in a number of acacia species. And this one on the screen there is the stiff leaf wattle Acacia obtrusifolia, which has got about 1% DMT in the bark of the tree and also in the root bark as well. This isn't the only acacia that contains DMT in Australia. A whole bunch of acacias contain DMT here. And for this reason, we've got probably higher rates of DMT use here in Australia than other countries do, because we've got it widely available in many naturally occurring species. And this is some DMT crystal, which can be extracted from the acacia bark relatively easily using household chemicals. People can basically extract the pure DMT out of it, and you can see there's a little pile of DMT crystal there. This is someone who's poured it out the liquid, and they're evaporating a solvent off to try and get that crystal out of it. That's an example of a light bulb vaporizer. This is a light bulb which someone has cleverly converted into a vaporizer using a bit of gaff tape and a bottle lid. This is probably the most common way of consuming DMT in Australia. We know that if you compare ayahuasca or oral DMT use to smoked crystal DMT, much more popular to smoke it. The vaporizer like this, the DMT would go into the light bulb and just be heated up until the bulb is full of the vapor and then inhaled in one big hit. When DMT is smoked, it doesn't last as long as the oral DMT because our brain is constantly breaking down that serotonin with monoamine oxidase. So the smoked DMT might last about 10 minutes or so in one hit, which is why it has to be smoked in a concentrated kind of form to get a large dose of it in one kind of hit. I think there's some Australian research which has looked at patterns of DMT use in Australia, and I think they got 98% of people who had used DMT had smoked it using a vaporizer, and we had really low rates of actual ayahuasca use, probably because the people using ayahuasca are slightly different. It's more of a new age kind of thing. They're probably not people necessarily fronting up for alcohol and drug research. This is DMT crystal which has been soaked into some kind of plant material. I would be guessing this is the most common way that we see it here in Australia. So this has been DMT applied to some herbal material, which can then just be rolled in a joint and smoked, just like cannabis, and sometimes referred to as changa or changa mix, which sometimes changa could be sold as a changa joint at a festival or whatever, pre-rolled. Because it's been soaked in a plant material, it's easier to smoke than that vaporizing process of a light bulb. So you might hear about changa. That's a pretty common slang term that people use. Some young folks don't actually know that the changa is DMT. They just think there's this herbal stuff called changa that you smoke. One of the telltale signs of smoked DMT, though, is it smells like burnt plastic. And if you've ever been at a music festival and you think there's a plastic fire breaking out, it's just DMT being smoked on the dance floor, because it's got a really, really distinct and really pungent smell. It does smell exactly like burnt plastic, and you will think that there's a fire. Sometimes, though, with this changa mix, people sometimes add a monoamine oxidase inhibitor into the mixture to smoke as well, to make the smoked DMT last longer. That's probably one of the biggest risks with DMT is the MAOI, the monoamine oxidase inhibitor. There's a reason why we don't use them as much in mental health treatment anymore as an antidepressant, because we know that a lot of food products can cause complications, so certain cheeses or beer, soy sauces, a whole range of different foods that can interact with MAOIs and can cause hypertensive crisis, which is why we don't tend to use them very commonly. And while the DMT itself is probably relatively low risk, the MAOI is the potential source of the risk, particularly when we don't know exactly what MAOI have they used in that, how long lasting is it. We also know the context in which that's used, say music festival. People are on other drugs as well, particularly MDMA, and MDMA combined with an MAOI can lead to serotonin toxicity and is quite dangerous. So that's probably the main sort of concern with that changa. I will say too, there was a time, not recently, but there was a time in the past when particular herbal high stores were selling changa mix over the counter, calling it Dream Time Herb, capital D, capital M, capital T. Wink, wink. That doesn't happen anymore. It's a Schedule 2 drug in Queensland. It's always been a Schedule 2 substance at the state level, and it's a Schedule 9 substance federally. So it's DMT is illegal. It's complicated in that it naturally occurs in lots of native plants. So obviously you're not going to be arrested if you happen to have an acacia in your backyard that happens to produce DMT. However, if you've got a whole big pile of acacia bark sitting there with some chemicals to extract it, then that's probably illegal. So the EDRS, the Ecstasy and Related Drugs Survey, is one of the few studies that can detect the rates of use. So this is a study that happens every year, and they interview regular psychostimulant users. So it's not a population survey. It's people who are regularly using ecstasy once a month for the previous 6 months to get into the study. So it's a sentinel survey. They detected 27% lifetime use and 23% recent use, and recent being in the previous 6 months, which if you kind of think about that means that there's a large recent uptake, that most of these people in this survey have recently tried DMT. So we do expect that there is a sort of expansion of access to DMT and more people becoming aware of it and trying it here in Queensland. They then also asked about ayahuasca, and in this sample they got no recent use of ayahuasca and 5% lifetime. Again, probably to do with the target group. These are young people going to music festivals. The people who are using ayahuasca are probably slightly more new age, looking for some spiritual awakening. So different kind of population group using the two different forms there. So as I mentioned, the oral ingestion requires an MAOI. People do use pharmaceutical MAOIs like meclobamide, Aurorix is one that people use, and they sometimes call it pharmahuasca, where they've used a pharmaceutical MAOI combined with DMT. There's also things like Syrian rue seed. Peganum humalo is an easily available source as well of MAOI, which people buy from plant shops. It's not itself illegal. Syrian rue is often used to dye things. It's a natural dye, will dye things red. So people use it in art and plant and carpet dyeing and all kinds of stuff like that. But it also contains a really potent MAOI as well. So the ayahuasca, when it's consumed orally, it lasts 4 to 6 hours once it passes through the gut, whereas when the DMT is smoked, it's about 10 to 15 minutes. DMT creates really intense hallucinations, particularly when it is smoked. People will report losing all contact with reality and have no awareness of their surroundings and can't get up and do things because they don't know where they are, followed by, when it's smoked, a rapid decline in effect. There's minimal after effects. There's no sort of come down like you'd expect with amphetamines where people have low mood or any sort of after effect, persistent after effect. Oh yeah, there's some potential clinical uses for ayahuasca. There's a study underway in the US at the moment looking at could ayahuasca have benefits for depression, and I think we've had a talk recently with Dr. Nick from here who'd been to the psychedelics conference in California, and ayahuasca is one of those hallucinogens that people are looking at for some potential therapeutic benefit. Because it's had such a long history of traditional use, they have done studies of populations that use ayahuasca regularly for traditional purposes and have found, some antidepressant effects amongst people who are regularly using it, and improved planning, some impaired working memory, etc. So there's some potential antidepressant or anti-addictive potential, and there's, I believe, a study underway in the US at the moment to try and look at is that potential, can that actually work? There's also been a few studies looking at, can it cause psychosis, because obviously really potent hallucinogen, that's the concern, is what kinds of negative effects could it be. This DMT Psychosis Systemic Review found a few case series around it. They found most of the cases involve someone with a family history. They also found that overall, given the rates of use being relatively high in particular populations, that this overall the risk of psychosis appears rare when you consider how many people do use it, although that's not the only risk that it could have. As I mentioned, probably the biggest risk is the MAOI, and in a context, recreational drug using context here in Australia, most people are combining drugs with other things, and that's a real risk with an MAOI. We know that there's risks of injuries when people are affected by a hallucinogen to the extent where they don't know their surroundings, can injure themselves, and people have injured themselves or walked in front of traffic or whatever. We know too that there's risks of contamination of the particularly ayahuasca tea, and that's happened before. In South America, particular shamans will add a range of other different plants into the tea as well for different reasons, and I'll mention a case of that in a sec. There's some risks associated with the extraction. When people are extracting DMT crystal, they're using flammable products and can blow themselves up. Respiratory conditions is another one, because when DMT is smoked, I mentioned the smell is like burnt plastic. So people who inhale it can have really severe asthma-like reactions, because it's not the same as just smoking cannabis or something. It's actually more like smoking burning plastic, and people can get really bad respiratory effects from that. And ayahuasca tourism has got a bunch of risks associated with it as well. I know one particular ayahuasca retreat which had an American guy died at this particular ayahuasca retreat. It turned out that the shaman who was running it would basically just dose all the American tourists on ayahuasca and then go back to his house and watch episodes of Family Guy until the morning, and then come out and take everyone's money. So that kind of thing has happened. This is a story from Foreign Correspondent earlier this year. It's still available online if you're interested in watching it, called "It Doesn't Happen to People Like Me." And it's a story of a young Australian guy who went over to South America and went to an ayahuasca retreat and died. And he didn't actually die from ayahuasca itself, but the day before taking the ayahuasca tea, the shaman gave everyone a preparatory tea that was designed to be a cleansing tea, which contained really high doses of tobacco leaf, and he died of a nicotine overdose, which is a pretty hideous kind of thing. But yeah, it was actually a nicotine overdose in that case. But it just sort of showed the risks that are now occurring because of ayahuasca tourism, and now that there's so much money in it and awareness of it, that there are sort of unregulated services that are offering this. And it's hard if someone wants a genuine, ayahuasca experience, and it's really hard to know what you're going to get, basically, because it's cowboy country. I'm going to try and show you a short video now of some ayahuasca being consumed here in Australia.
The ayahuasca brew is made by combining the South American vine and the leaves of other plants that contain the psychedelic compound dimethyltryptamine, or DMT.
So this is actually ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is the vine. It's called Banisteriopsis caapi. The ayahuasca, without the DMT in the plant, will not actually give the person visions.
In a legal sense, the use of DMT is a problem. Under current Australian law, it's classified as a Schedule 9 prohibited substance, the same as drugs like marijuana, LSD and ecstasy. It's against the law to use it, sell it or manufacture it. But DMT is also a naturally occurring substance. It's found in many forms of organic life, including our own bodies. And there just happens to be very high quantities in some Australian species of acacia, which is what Julian uses to make his Australian ayahuasca, and what these people will be drinking tonight.
The visions are very colourful and crisp, but it's not too intense or overwhelming for people. The way I go about this is very without fanfare. It's very informal. All I'm doing is pouring the tea. It's not about the cup. It's about what's in the cup.
Within about 30 to 40 minutes, the ayahuasca begins to take effect.
I play music and I burn some crazy incense from Bhutan and the Middle East, and ideally they go deeply in themselves and work through whatever they want to work through.
At some ceremonies, it's about this point where people experience what they call the purge.
There's a lot of different ways to purge, like including yawning, and whether you get diarrhea, it can be part of it. It is about getting rid of all the baggage that doesn't serve us anymore.
Everyone's got a bucket in front of them, and You want to have that close by because sometimes it can just really come up all of a sudden.
This time, for whatever reason, the buckets weren't needed. In fact, on the outside, nothing much seemed to be happening at all.
How you feeling, Matthew? You probably go deeper this week, tonight.
Yes. Really hoping to.
On the inside, we're told it was a very different matter.
How are you feeling? Okay, that's great.
It's visions, and it's obviously the visions you see are very specific to either your life or something that you need to know. We're always shown what we need to see, and sort of what we do with it is up to us.
It's very, very deep and very personal, but essentially I felt like my mind was just exploding with awareness and consciousness beyond what I've experienced as a human being before.
So you can see there a little piece of an Australian person getting right into the ayahuasca there. You can also see there's a bit of a messiah complex, grandiose kind of thing goes on with it, which is, interesting. And it's like many of these new age kinds of things. There's people have really strong beliefs about how effective it is, and I know that there's a lot of different opinions even amongst people who are very interested in ayahuasca. There's a number of very different opinions about that particular fellow and what he's up to there. Particularly brave administering a scheduled substance like that on television to lots of different people. But yeah, that's an example of ayahuasca in the Australian context. I'm going to shift it now to psilocybin, magic mushrooms, which is here in Queensland, relatively popular. We're not in the season at the moment. We're off season. But this is the classic Queensland gold top. Now, for people not in Queensland, the word gold top is a slang term for many different types of mushrooms. So gold tops in Victoria or New Zealand or overseas is not the same as it is here. In Queensland, Psilocybe cubensis is the magic mushroom that we refer to as gold tops. These are traditionally used also in South America and Mexico, and this is a bunch of different traditional sort of statues showing the mushroom god Tunukdal and the different types of ceremonies and things. So more so used in the northern part of South America. This is a close-up of the Psilocybe cubensis growing in cow poo. You can see it obviously coming out of the dung there. They grow in summertime here after lots of rain, and then they'll come up from usually about December till about March or April, more so in North Queensland than down here, than in Queensland. That's a close-up. You can see the slightly staining blue on the stem there. That's the psilocin and psilocybin reacting with oxygen and turning blue. A lot of people will identify the magic mushrooms by the ones that stain blue, which is not always accurate. There are some other mushrooms that turn blue which are not psychoactive as well. These are some picked ones. You can start to see them turning blue again there. This is the other species we get here in Queensland known as blue meanies. So blue meanies and gold tops are the two common terms that people have for them. The blue meanies here are called Copelandia cyanescens is the scientific name for them. They also grow in dung, but there's many other lookalikes very close that look almost the same as the blue meanies. They're quite hard to differentiate from other types of mushrooms. Luckily for us in Queensland, there's not too many mushrooms that will kill you that look really, really similar to magic mushrooms. That's not true in southern states or in New Zealand. There are other mushrooms that look exactly like magic mushrooms that will kill you in other states. In Queensland, though, we just have mushrooms that will make you really sick and vomit and have diarrhea for a few days, which is kind of lucky because some of the others are quite toxic. That's just another close-up of them. We have relatively high rates of use of magic mushrooms. So again, from the EDRS, they got 53% lifetime use of magic mushrooms and 26% recent use in the previous 6 months. Again, this figure would vary with the season. So I know in summertime you hear lots more about it, and then we won't hear about it again now until probably December or January. There's also different regions where it's more common. We did have one poor little residential service phoned us because the young people were using lots of magic mushrooms mushrooms, and I said to them, do you live near a cow paddock perchance? And they actually, yes, they backed onto a dairy farm. And I was like, wow, that's a real problem, because you've got potentially like constant access to magic mushrooms throughout the wet season. So they also come in a dried form. So in the last few years, there's a sort of emerging illicit market for magic mushrooms. It used to just be fresh mushrooms in season that people go picking with their friends. But there's been this sort of growing illicit market for them. People can dry them out like this, and then they'll last. Then they can be on-sold or whatever. Whereas the fresh mushrooms will go off really quickly. They'll disintegrate really, really fast. They're often just boiled up in a tea and drunk as a tea. Really difficult for people to know the doses that they're taking like that. There can be massive variations in dose just between one mushroom and the next. So it's not that uncommon for people to have way too much when they're consuming it in this manner, particularly when it's in a tea form. That tea is absorbed really rapidly in the gut and making a very intense, rapid onset of effect, which can be quite overwhelming. This is some dried magic mushrooms ground up into a powder and put into capsules. And we've seen this as well over the last couple of years, as we've seen this sort of commercialising of them, that people are, stuffing them in caps and then selling them as mushroom capsules on the illicit drug market. In this case here, they've been made into chocolate as well. These are little chocolate moulds that someone's put them in as well. So they come in a variety of different kinds of forms. There's also a sort of home cultivation of magic mushrooms as well. And actually, I think just last week in Adelaide, the police did a massive seizure of a very elaborate magic mushroom growing operation that a couple were running and selling them on the dark net, on the dark internet. But they had a whole number of tubs producing magic mushrooms in their house, which they were then drying up and selling. So since that's sort of been a shift in the market that we've seen over the last couple of years with magic mushrooms. We know a lot about psilocybin though, because it's one of the first hallucinogens that was discovered in the 1950s. So there's been quite a bit of research around about how it works. It lasts 4 to 6 hours. It's got some potential clinical uses, and there's been a few studies that it's looked at psilocybin for people with terminal illness, and can it reduce anxiety related to death. And there's a number of studies going on looking at that, and looking at a few other potential uses for it, for example, depression as well. We know that it's got, compared to other substances, it's got relatively low risk of harm. I know when David Nutt and his colleagues were looking at a way of sort of scaling all of the different substances and ranking them for their potential harms, magic mushrooms comes almost as the lowest risk of harm of all of the substances. Global Drug Survey also asks people to rank their substances based on pleasure versus negative effects, and actual negative effects that they've experienced. And magic mushrooms, again, comes very low down the list of harmful substances. Having said that, they were legally available in the Netherlands for a number of years over the counter, and there was quite a few tourists consuming them and doing things like jumping off buildings and whatever, and having those bad trip sort of reactions and injuring themselves. So there's definitely that risk with them. The biggest risk is misidentifying wild mushrooms, and as I mentioned, in Queensland, not so much a risk of death, but a risk of becoming really, really sick. Particularly when people go out and pick a whole big bag of mushrooms, there might just be 1 or 2 toxic mushrooms in that bag, and that's enough to make everyone sick. We know that accidents and injuries is another one. Any hallucinogen has risks of that. Bad trip reactions, where people have that really intense panic from it, the overwhelming effect of it, and contamination as well. So the mushrooms can go off and people can get sick just from them becoming rotten. The next plant we're going to look at is mescaline, most famously in the form of peyote, and this is a close-up of a peyote cactus. Peyote is used traditionally in North America by Native American people. Again, similar to how mushrooms and ayahuasca is used in South America, used as in a healing context, but also recreational context as well. Peyote itself is really slow growing. It takes maybe 30 years for a peyote cactus to grow big enough for someone to consume it. So because of that, it's actually become an endangered plant because it is in the US. It's legally legally be used by Native American people, but they can't really produce enough to keep that market supplied. So instead, the more common version is the San Pedro cactus, Trichocereus pachanoi, and you might recognise it. It's a relatively common 1970s garden ornament. It's sometimes sold in plant shops to this day. Most people wouldn't know that it does contain mescaline in it. The San Pedro cactus grows really, really quickly. It'll grow tall columns really, really fast, whereas peyote grows extremely slowly. So that's probably why San Pedro is the more common form. There's a close-up of it. The way people would use it would be just chop it up and boil it up with water, boil it for hours and hours and hours until it forms like a black tar, a black disgusting goop, which people then drink. And the mescaline chemical is quite stable and so survives all of the heat, and they're basically evaporating off as much moisture as they can until they get a concentrated mescaline goop, basically, which they then consume. However, just like magic mushrooms, there's a sort of commercial market evolving for it, and that's involved slicing it up and drying it into little chips. And once it's dried, it's more stable, and then it can be sold. And these are some dried cactus chips, and it has been sold like this, again, in some herbal high shops, but also on the illicit market, or ground up into a fine powder, which people often just refer to as cactus powder. And we've had a few calls from services that have had young people reporting taking cactus powder. And if you come across that, someone referring to cactus powder, it's probably a mescaline-containing cactus powder that they're taking. And this has got, a decent amount of mescaline in it. The IDRS, once again, IDRS did find some rates of use, again, much lower than the other drugs. So they got 7% lifetime and 1% recent use of mescaline in the 2016 EDRS. Previous years have been a little bit higher than that. That was a little bit lower than normal. It's a longer acting than magic mushrooms. It lasts up to about 12 hours or so. It was when hallucinogens were first discovered back in the 50s and the 60s, there was research using mescaline to treat alcohol problems and a whole bunch of different things. And some of that research showed some potential, but it hasn't really been researched since then. And it's not currently been researched either. They're looking instead at some of the other ones. There is some, because it has been used by Native American people, there's been some really good research looking at that population though. So people who've used it in some cases since very early childhood. Mescaline, peyote would be given to children, to 2 and 3 year old children. They followed a whole bunch of people and they looked at a bunch of Navajos who had minimal other substance use, no other alcohol use. The peyote group had no deficits. They had no deficits in neuropsychological performance, no evidence of cognitive deficits. They compared them to a matched group using alcohol who had massive cognitive deficits, etc. So we can't exactly generalise that to recreational hallucinogen users, but it does sort of show that in a traditional context, a lot of these drugs are managed and used in ways that are relatively low risk of harm. Again, accidents and injuries is one of the problems with any hallucinogen when people aren't aware of their surroundings. There is mescaline tourism is a thing as well, more so in the northern part of South America, so in Peru, just like ayahuasca tourism in the south. Mescaline tourism is happening in the Andes, and you can go and take cactus. And again, all of the same risks associated with that kind of tourism. Poppies is our next plant. And it's a great photograph there because it shows you the entire life cycle of Papaver somniferum, opium poppy, from the flower right through to the dry seed pod there at the end. And we see people using kind of all of them. Opium poppies grow really easily. They grow really easily here in Queensland. They grow actually easy anywhere, pretty much. You might know them from bread rolls. Now, the poppy seeds on your bread rolls probably come from Tasmanian opium poppies. They're not like a special opium poppy is grown for our bread rolls. We have a massive opium poppy industry for the legit medical purposes, and a lot of that seed is what we have on our bread rolls. They do try to sterilise those seeds, but it's not exactly effective. It's maybe 50% of those seeds are sterile, but there's a lot of seeds on each bread roll. So people can actually get a bread roll and scrape the seeds into the garden and grow opium poppies. It's actually that easy. But the seed itself has got a little bit of morphine and some other opioids on the outer shell. So the seeds themselves don't contain any opioids, but there are opioids on the outsides of them. Now, if you buy Master Foods seeds, they're probably washed. They're probably quite well washed. But there are different ethnic communities and ethnic grocery stores that maybe sell kilo bags of them that aren't washed and do contain viable quantities of opioids, and actually a range of different opioids, not morphine and codeine being the main ones, but there's a whole bunch of others as well. So you may have come across clients using them. I know I have come across clients using poppy seed, sometimes already opioid dependent, but using poppy seed as an adjunct, or if they can't get on for a few days. Or I've also met clients who tried using poppy seed to detox themselves off heroin and figured they could just reduce their dose, kind of thing. It's really tricky and kind of dangerous because you can't determine how many opioids are in them, and people have overdosed and died from poppy seed. If they purchase a particular brand regularly, then there's massive inconsistencies in the doses that they're potentially going to get out of those seeds. So that's a close-up of some opium poppies. The main alkaloids are codeine, morphine, but also thebaine is another one. Thebaine used to make oxycodone, and thebaine is a little bit different and quite toxic in high doses. And there are particular strains of opium poppies grown in Tasmania which are meant to be really high thebaine to produce oxycodone, and people have died from consuming those poppy pods. You can't tell from looking at it which is a thebaine dominant poppy and which is a morphine dominant poppy. They all look the same, but a lot of them are quite low morphine, very high thebaine. So it's that's kind of toxic. There's also paparavine is another chemical in there, which is a vasodilator, noscapine, and those different chemicals happen in different ratios. So that's one of the major risks with them. We know that the ornamental poppies, so people can sometimes buy poppies from like florists, and they have dried poppies because they look pretty, and you can even see them like at Freedom Furniture sometimes. They'll have like those ornaments in the corner of the vase and some dried stuff, and there's sometimes dried poppies in them. In the Netherlands, they did a study of the ornamental dried poppies from homeware stores, and they found the average morphine content 362 milligrams of morphine per 100 grams. But the variation was from 150 milligrams of morphine up to 670 milligrams of morphine per 100 grams of ornamental poppy. So that's a really, really high dose in 100 grams of dried poppy. There was a time online where there was a big online opium poppy community, and they used to purchase, there were shops which specialised in dried poppy pods for flower arranging, which was not really for flower arranging. It was just a way of selling dried opium poppies. That's not such an issue in Australia because of our customs here is always looking out for plants, but we do know people come across them occasionally and use them for that purpose. So this is an example of how some people might use them, is just chopping them up and adding them to a plunger or boiling them up with some boiling water, maybe a little bit of lemon juice to try and get the alkaloid to come out, and then just drink it. There is a significant overdose risk, obviously, from it, just not knowing what the dose is and how long it can take for it to affect. And we know that there can be dependence as well. I had a young fellow years ago now who had become dependent on opioids from growing his own poppies. And he grew it. He was living in student accommodation at a university and grew a big batch of poppies on his little veranda. So not a huge quantity, but they're so potent, and he grew them so effectively. He had enough to use opioids pretty consistently for about 3 months, and it was enough to induce physical dependence. And we had to get him onto buprenorphine to help him get off that. And that was off a single grow cycle that he had just done on his balcony. So it definitely can occur. It definitely can happen. That's just another pretty picture of opium poppies. Okay, and our final plant that we will tour is the famous angel trumpet. Datura stramonium, and this is a picture here of Datura itself. We often refer to all of it as Datura, which it's not really. This is Datura stramonium on the screen there. This is the Brugmansia species, though, which is a bit more common here in Queensland. They're very pretty plants. They're quite beautiful. But this particular species, they contain a whole range of different alkaloids. They're basically all tropane alkaloids. So they're things like anticholinergic, so mostly atropine and scopolamine, but a whole bunch of other ones as well. The different alkaloids occur in different ratios at different times of year, or whether there's been rain. Also, different parts of the plant contain different ratios of alkaloids at different times of the year. They traditionally have used Datura in South America. They'd sometimes add it to ayahuasca. They would sometimes add the Datura to ayahuasca if warriors needed to increase their bravery. They would give them some Datura, which is a bit frightening. It can also be smoked. The leaf can be smoked as well as a tea drunk out of the flowers or whatever. They're not technically a hallucinogen. A hallucinogen, if you're hallucinating, you're aware that you're hallucinating. Datura is a deliriant. It makes people delirious, and so they're not aware of that is occurring, and so much more risky in terms of how people injure themselves, because they will wander around in front of traffic and have no awareness of their surroundings and can become quite a risk to themselves and other people. This is an Australian study which looked at a whole bunch of people that had presented to emergency departments following Datura ingestion over a 10-year period. They looked at 33 patients. They all had dilated pupils. Obviously, it's one of the uses of those tropane alkaloids is to dilate pupils when you go to the optometrist. But they all had really dilated pupils that lasted for a very long time. Only 88% delirium. I would have guessed 100%. But duration 18 hours. It's quite long. It's quite frightening. 33% tachycardia. They didn't get any deaths or any seizures. They had some accidental injuries, and a bunch of them required some kind of sedation as well. One of the issues with Datura, and this has happened in Queensland a couple of times, is that young people have consumed it and freaked out and then dropped their friends off at the ED and run away and left them there. And so an emergency department has got a presentation of these people who are strangely delirious, and we don't know why. And that's a bit of a shame, because those tropane alkaloids can be quite dangerous when combined with some antipsychotics. And if we don't know that that's what they're intoxicated on, it makes their management much more difficult. So it doesn't happen that often, but in Australia, about once a year, a group of kids somewhere will find an angel trumpet plant and all go and take it. The joke is that people don't tend to do it more than once, because it's not particularly pleasant being delirious like that. Although for young people often think that it's just a plant and makes you see things, it sounds like it would be an awesome kind of time, but it's generally not. So they also got, this paper also looked at what to do with any patients that come in with the Datura intoxication. They found that they could be agitated, combative, confused or disorientated. And then in severe cases, they do have a medication regime there, which I'll leave on the screen for you to have a look at as the best treatment option. Again, given that some of the antipsychotics can be contraindicated with those tropane alkaloids. So that's all I've got time for the wonderful world of plants. Now, if you are coming across any wacky plants or clients using wacky plants, the Queensland Herbarium offers an awesome service. You can actually give them a ring and just have a chat to them if someone does come in or a client has a question. You can ring up the Herbarium, and they're experts at identifying plants. I believe they mostly get calls from pet owners concerned about their dogs, because the same plants in your backyard can poison dogs as teenagers. But you can email them. They've also got, if you have an actual plant sample that you are interested in, there's instructions on their website of how to package that plant up and mail it to them, and they'll do a formal identification of an actual plant sample. So you can ring and chat to them or email them. They're very friendly. They're extreme plant geeks. And if you ring them with a question, they will chew your ear off, and they'll just love it that you're interested in it. So check out the Herbarium. They're at the Botanical Gardens at Mount Cootha as well, if you ever want to go and visit and have a chat with them.